Leanne Rodrigues is the Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. He is also the CEO for a nonprofit ministry called Global Horizons, Inc., based in the Twin Cities, but with projects in a number of countries. He has a wife, Sophie, and 3 children, all of whom are living independently here in the metro. He and his wife are also now parenting their college-age niece who is living with them. Leon is a lay leader at Camphor Memorial United Methodist Church in St. Paul, a predominantly African-American congregation. He preaches and administers communion regularly in this congregation. Leon was born and raised in South Africa, and after the apartheid system was abolished, he and his family moved to the United States to further their education. Leon completed his doctorate at the University of Minnesota and graduated in 2003 and has served as an administrator, program developer, and faculty member in several higher education institutions, including the U of M, Bethel, the Minnesota State Colleges and University System, and the U of M Extension Services. So Leon, thank you so much for being here. Leon and I have had the opportunity now to cross paths in a number of different contexts, and it's really a pleasure again to be able to be in the same Zoom room with you, at least right now. So I look forward to learning more, and I'll hand it over to you from here.
Well, good evening. Wow, what a night. We had a power failure, and so I've had to improvise as much as I could, but I'm happy to be here. Just had dinner by candlelight, and as romantic as that sounds, it reminded me of my childhood. I did not have electricity until I was about the age of 20. Took me back to my childhood, but glad to be with all of you. I wish I could see your faces. I know that you have watched the first segment with myself and Vivian Jenkins Nelson, and I do want to say thank you to Vivian and to Rachel for the technical support and Vivian's great questions. But tonight I want to spend a little time so that we can have some discussion about the role of the church in addressing the issues of racial justice, which, as you know, we are called to love each other. We are called to live in shalom with each other. And the type of racism I experienced both in South Africa and here in the United States certainly is not fitting with the kind of witness we are called to be. So tonight, instead of dwelling too much on South Africa, which I will spend a little time on that, I do want us to spend some time on how we as Christians can face this evil in our society. And so I hope to use examples from South Africa, but I've lived in the United States long enough to also be able to reflect on life and experiences here. I do want to start just by saying, I lament, and I think we all lament and grieve that we are surrounded just by so much sadness and death and hardship and discouragement due to the cumulative effects of the pandemic throughout this country and in fact throughout the world. Also, just our concerns with the wave of racial inequality, the protests, just the tough time in this society as people reckon with structural racism, and of course also an extremely contentious political season. And I do want to acknowledge that and bring that before our God and raise that because in this time, it is upon God that we call and upon God that we put our trust in. So somebody commented on the pain in my story and the pain of retelling it each time. And while it is painful and while it re-victimizes me, there are a few reasons why I do it. First is I want to give people hope that amidst this kind of struggle, God is still faithful. God has been faithful throughout my life. And I can be here today, even though I know there were many times that I came close to death and should not have been here. But God had a purpose in my life, and God gave me the strength and continues to give me the strength to be able to tell the story. And perhaps telling the story also reaches the hearts of others, um, particularly those who may not have had the experiences I've had, whether they are fortunate or unfortunate. Sharing my story of the evils of racism hopefully will illuminate some of the wrongs that we see in our society. And then also talking about the racism I experience is a way of inviting you to partner with me to build a better church, a better community with empathy and compassion, self-sacrifice, and trust in God to lead us in this very difficult situation. It also gives me great courage to speak to fellow Christians because we believe in God's word, and we live out God's word, which calls us to justice and which calls us to serve and love each other. So I recently preached about Matthew 5. We are all in the same boat was my title. So if you get home, you can read Matthew 5, Jesus in the boat and the disciples just freaking out and getting all anxious. And Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith." Um, I also preached on Psalm 129 and just try to give people hope in this time. Um, for tonight, I also want to frame this conversation in a way that we did in South Africa during our political upheaval and difficult time. 2 Chronicles 7 verse 14, if my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. Oh, I'm sure you're all yearning for healing in our society. I know that many of the people that I interact with, and also many of the people whom I speak with, particularly oppressed people, yearn for healing. In fact, we all have come through many traumatic situations, traumatic experiences, and healing is one of the main activities for me these days. Is how do we find healing? Well, one way to find healing is truth telling. And I just heard that the one of the council members, Andrea Jenkins from Minneapolis, wants to do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Minneapolis. And as you know, in South Africa, we did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to purge our society of many of the atrocities that we had gone through and that we had experienced, and which you heard me talk about on Sunday morning. So having said that, I want to jump into some of the questions that was sent to me. One of those questions was about the book of Trevor Noah. And I'm sure many of you have read Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime. I'm really proud of Trevor Noah, my fellow countryman, who I never thought that would become such a formidable comedian and personality in the United States. So I'm really proud of him. Of all the people that could have been chosen to do the Daily Show, that Trevor Noah was chosen. He's an absolutely brilliant young man. I don't go along with too much of the cussing, but I guess that's part of his youth culture. And I'm much older than Trevor. Trevor writes that he was 6 years old when Nelson Mandela was released. Well, I was about 20 years old at the time. But I saw the hardships that Trevor's parents must have seen, and both in my community as well as throughout the country. And, by the time Trevor was 8 years old, I was going to vote for the first time in my life to vote for a president of our country. And my dad, who was probably around the age of 60, was the first time my dad had the opportunity to vote for a president in our country. It was 1994 elections when Nelson Mandela was elected. So living in the United States, I don't take my vote for granted. I believe that we have a responsibility, and so I vote every time. But I went and I voted for Nelson Mandela, whom I was very excited about. In fact, one of the best days of my life was to see Nelson Mandela walk out of prison. And you won't believe the kind of day that was. We didn't know Nelson Mandela was going to be released until an announcement came on television. The state president then came on and announced that Nelson Mandela was going to be released, and several of the banned political parties were now going to be unbanned. We never expected that, not that soon, even though we were fighting and pushing for political change and for justice in South Africa. So that was a great day. It felt like just a huge celebration. I could swear all the cars that day were going in the same direction. They were going to where Nelson Mandela was going to appear for the first time after being in prison for 27 years. And I was happy that my wife and I could experience that event. So one more thing I would say out of that question was about the bloodshed in South Africa, that the comment was made in Trevor Noah's book that Nelson Mandela's takeover and the birth of a democratic South Africa was a bloodless revolution. Well, I disagree with Trevor on that, because I have seen a lot of bloodshed as I lived in a what we call a township, and which in the United States you'll probably call a neighborhood or a city. If you were Black in South Africa, you lived in a township. If you were white, you lived in a suburb. And I saw a lot of bloodshed. I saw, a Black man shot right in front of me. And every time there's shooting, both here in our city and other cities around the nation, it triggers that day when I saw the police shoot a man at point blank range. This man had done nothing wrong. He was assumed to have been part of a protest march. And very unfortunately, he came down an alley and walked right into a number of police who sat with their guns ready. And I just saw the policeman just shoot him right in the stomach. And I hid behind some trees with my camera, and I took a picture of the man falling to his knees with everything inside of his stomach pouring out of his belly on the ground. Now, I don't want to traumatize you by giving you all these details, but I still have that picture, and I never developed that picture. We still were using 35 millimeter for those of you who remember those days. I hid the film, and I brought the film with me when I came to the United States, and I had that picture developed here in the US. And I will never forget that bloodshed daily in South Africa. And so I don't agree that it was a bloodless revolution. Blood had been flowing since the British, the Portuguese, and the Dutch came to grab the land in South Africa. and drove the indigenous people out of the mainland into reservations, which were called homelands. Also enslaved or tried to enslave, particularly the Khoisan, and put them in prison on Robben Island, which is where Nelson Mandela was held. So that's maybe one of the places where I disagree with Trevor Noah, but I've always said to many of my family members that when reading Trevor Noah's book, it could have been my life as well. I could clearly identify with a lot of what Trevor Noah had said in his book. So another question was around the British and the British coming to South Africa and offering the natives some hope and giving them a better life. I disagree with that. The British were the ones who brought a type of discrimination, which we call petty apartheid, which was a separation of the British people who imitated, even if they weren't aristocracy, they imitated that as them being better than us. And they separated themselves and utilized the Black labor in South Africa to work as servants and to work in shops and restaurants. And so I don't think that gave us a lot of hope, but they brought a racial hierarchy. It might not have been called racism at the time, but it certainly was a type of caste system. And we internalized the fact that we were inferior because we couldn't afford to dress the way they did. We couldn't use the facilities that they did. And when the Afrikaners won the election against the British, or the English as we called them, they instituted a system of racial segregation, which was a legal segregation. So I'm going to stop there because I want to get to questions that you might have. So you could either put your question in the chat, or you could just, I believe you could probably unmute your mic and just ask the question. I wish I could see your face.
Leon, I think I can actually, because it is a bit of a smaller group, I think due to the weather in part, I could actually turn on the videos of other participants. I've asked some permission to do so. If it would be a little bit more conversational with cameras on, what would be your preference?
My preference would be to see everybody.
Okay, I will try to do that then. As I'm working that out, anyone who has a question immediately is free to ask. All right. Leon, I know one question that I have had, and I'm going to try to get my camera on here, is just, you shared a bit about some of the parallels that you saw between the system in South Africa and the system here. And I'd be curious, especially, with the events of this year, have there been, have some of those similarities been highlighted in a new way, or maybe not in a new way? Maybe this is just kind of the same thing that people have been seeing all along, but some of us are just seeing it in a new way. But I'd be curious to hear about your just thoughts on this year.
Yeah, well, one of the things that stood out to me was nonviolence. We worked really hard in South Africa for a nonviolent approach to social change. And as I worked with different groups and listened to them, people were very set on this being a nonviolent protest, nonviolent ways of bringing about social change. Another thing that happened, particularly around the George Floyd protests, was the infiltration of people who had bad motives, people who were out to create mayhem and chaos and attack and burn down buildings. We had the same in South Africa. We fought really hard to maintain an ethical and peaceful struggle for change. And as a Christian, I firmly believed that it was not my right to take somebody else's life, no matter how they treat me. But when I was watching the burning down of Super America, the Wells Fargo Bank, I said, who are those people? They are not interested in change. They're interested in chaos. And that really concerned me. Now, I'm not saying that people who have struggled for decades and decades to bring about change and to bring about racial justice would not be filled with resentment, because I also saw a lot of resentment in South Africa, the name calling, just nastiness because of resentment. I mean, even as a child, we fought with white boys just because we were racially different, and we were tired of being beaten up by them. So we would also arm ourselves with whips or whatever we could find to fight back. But what I am saying is violence is not the answer. Violence begets violence. And I know that a lot of my friends in Palestine often disagree with that. But I feel that America is a country of laws, is a country that has a particular inclination to democratic processes. And therefore, I believe that acknowledging and sounding our protest should be a way to indicate a community's dissatisfaction. And that's what we did in South Africa. So what I saw was many in my community, many in my church, beginning to speak out. And there is a cost to speaking out. First of all, you're afraid of being victimized, you're afraid of being minimized, you're afraid of being ignored, or you're afraid of just being ridiculed for speaking out. You're afraid of not being believed when you speak out, when you talk about your experiences of racism. And I was on a panel a couple of years ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, in downtown St. Paul. My wife had participated in murals which had been put up about immigrants in downtown St. Paul. And so my wife and my son are in a picture. And we were invited, and I was asked to speak on this panel. And an immigrant man from Pakistan disagreed with me. He said, there's no racism here. I've never experienced racism in America. I've come here from Pakistan and I've become a professional and I live a good life. And I said, who have you been talking to? Where do you live? If you choose to live where I live, if you go to the kind of church I go to, and if you listen to people in those communities, and if you read and study the history of this country, you will know that there is racism in this country. I couldn't speak for his individual experience, but I certainly could speak for the experience of many, many people that I have met in this country, and my own experiences almost being shot by the police, and my son's experience constantly being pulled over by the police, and also almost being shot by the police in St. Paul. So those are some of the things that occurred to me this year, as people took to the streets, as we called for Black Lives Matter. Now, I have always been a supporter of Black Lives Matter, and I'll tell you why. Because Black life didn't seem to matter since I've come to the United States. And I am not saying all lives don't matter, but when a house is on fire, we don't go with hoses to all the houses. We go to the house that's on fire. And if Black people are being killed and mistreated and injured at a greater rate than anybody else in this country, Blacks and Latinos, then we need to attend to that. And that's what I saw this year when I saw Black lives. In fact, I was a little concerned because after Philando Castile was killed, Black Lives Matter seemed to become dormant. And I come from a protest culture, and I believe in those nonviolent means. I got a little worried that Black Lives Matter seemed to have become dormant. I said, there we go again. We're relaxing again. So I hope 2020, no matter how challenging it is, has taught us some great lessons. And I hope we don't relent on our efforts to address racial justice in the church, first of all, because we are setting the example to the world. Because we say we are driven by love. We're driven by Corinthians 13. And so I hope we don't relax and relent. We live in an unequal society.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Did a question spring to mind for anyone else? Barbara, looks like you might have.
Yes, hi, Dwayne. Leon, one, it's on the side of laws, but when you talk specifically, though, about church and church changing, I mean, where have you seen where really hearts and minds have changed? It's one thing to say we're praying for it and we really are against it, and there's lots of words spoken. And I'm not saying that I don't think that the intent is there, but clearly when we have decades and hundreds of years go by and change hasn't happened, to me, there's a hearts and mind issue in order to deal with racial inequality. Part of that I look at Genesis 33, Jacob and Esau reconciliation. That's there. But I mean, have you seen where the hearts and minds have been changed? And you can say, this is an example. I read the book on reconciliation in South Africa, but I just would like to know where you've seen this done successfully, that maybe there's a model that can be followed elsewhere.
Yeah. Oh, that is a remarkable question, Barbara. So I believe in reconciliation. I believe we need to come back to the shalom God had instilled in our world. And I've worked really hard over the years for reconciliation, but I've also been very, very saddened by the fact that the reconciliation I've seen was rather superficial. Many of the churches have saddened me, that churches that I've attended who said on a Sunday, we love you, brother, we love you, sister. And by Monday, I don't see that reality anymore. Until next Sunday, I hear, I love you, brother. You are my brother. You are my sister. I'm going to come to your question about where have I seen the successes, but I certainly have been very, very saddened by even the leadership roles I've had, working with the highest executive body in colleges and universities, where decisions are made to preserve the institution rather than decisions being made to bring about justice for those who cannot even afford to be in that school or college. And I fought very hard for that. But self-preservation, the preservation of institutions that are not accountable to the community. And so when I saw the kind of the graduation rates of students of color, or the fact that those students were not even in the school, or the way in which they were served, I was really, really saddened by that. The kinds of successes I have seen were in smaller communities.
Looks like Leon has frozen. Hopefully he'll be able to rejoin. It's a bit of a, for those who are watching on Sunday morning, the electricity has gone out across the city. And so I think we're having a little bit more technical difficulties than usual. And we're also a bit of a small crowd. But we're really excited that Leon was able to join us despite electricity being out. And I hope that he will be able to rejoin us. I'm enjoying this conversation, especially given the time. It looks like, hold on, I see him again. Leon.
He came back.
Is that my computer that keeps cutting out?
I think it might be, yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I don't know the kind of
That's
band.
all right. It's just technology and the way that it works, especially on a stormy night. So thanks for trying again.
You're welcome. I am sorry, but I don't know the bandwidth at this home. I usually make sure that at my home we have very stable internet. So as I said, I met Jim and Nadine Addington, and they used to do workshops on anti-racism from a biblical perspective. And they were known throughout many congregations. A husband and wife who clearly had dedicated their lives. Nadine has since passed away. But I joined that group because I was very interested in finding a group of people who thought the way I did about racism, who were committed to it. And many of us who were trained by Jim and Nadine are still doing this work today. And I've done it wherever I've come, even if I felt sometimes I don't think anybody's going to listen to me. If we can get people to continue to be committed in that way, at least we will have converted some people. Now, the structural change that I'd love to see in this society seems to be a lot tougher, but I am seeing some changes when I look at what is happening both in local government, when I listen to conversations in nonprofits, and I am seeing some minute changes. Corporations are also beginning to make some changes. They might be the low-hanging fruit, but I hope and I'm praying that they will gain momentum. But one of the biggest problems I experience in the United States is the fact that people think to eliminate racism means as an individual, I have to do it. And we can never do it on our own. A soldier does not go into battle alone. We have to form coalitions, and those coalitions might go beyond the boundaries of our church, or they might go beyond the boundaries of our family. We're going to have to work with different people. In South Africa, we had what was called the Mass Democratic Movement, which was a multi-faith, multi-ethnic coalition of people protesting, marching every day for change. We buried many of our followers. Many of the people in the movement were shot and killed by the police who attacked many of the marchers. People were prepared to die. But you can't do it alone. We have to form strong coalitions with each other. We have to pray about this. We fasted and we prayed. When I met Bishop Tutu for the first time. I knew of him, but had never met him. I met him at what was called the South African Christian Leadership Assembly, and I spoke about that. And the theologian whose name I couldn't remember was Professor David Bosch. And I know a lot of people in the United States who have studied missiology know Professor David Bosch. But I met Bishop Tutu there, and a group of probably 6,000 Christians came together to say, we are going to go back to the biblical ways. And that meant they had to renounce apartheid segregation in South Africa. And I don't think all 6,000 people committed themselves for the long term. They may have done it for that moment because we're at this big conference. We're all together. People are confessing. People are crying. But I'm sure a great percentage of that group committed, and we saw changes. We saw challenges to the church, which had become quite imbibed by the apartheid ideology. And we saw people pushing for change in their own churches, even to the point where they were excommunicated from their churches. And they formed new groups, and many of them went to seminary, became pastors, and led with a justice mindset. And we saw people like Reverend Alan Bosak, who went to study in Holland. He was a member of the state church, the Dutch Reformed Church. And he came back and spoke with authority about the heresy of apartheid. And he became the leader of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches and led a justice movement. I'd like to see our people in our congregations lead justice movements. Now, I don't have all the answers, but we don't need to have all the answers. We just need to have the strength in our unity. We can study what are the best approaches. Somebody actually asked me, what should the church do? How do we overcome this issue? And I said, I can't answer that question on my own. Once we build unity with each other, we will have to create a vision for which we are striving. My vision alone is but a singular vision, but we can create a vision for our community. People always ask me the question when I used to teach multicultural education at the University of Minnesota, how do we become a multicultural society? Well, we have so many cultural groups in our society. I can't speak on behalf of all of those groups. I can't even speak on behalf of the African American group, which I identify with. But when people trust each other, they will confide in each other and say, this is my need. This is what I'd like to see for my children. Even though I've gone through all the hardship, I would not like to see my children go through the same hardships. In fact, when we went to several of the George Floyd protest marches, my wife said, we are doing this for our grandchildren. We've raised our children already. We wouldn't like to see our grandchildren live in an unequal society like this. I don't know, Barbara, if I've given you all the answers, but I certainly believe that as I read earlier, if we humble ourselves and pray, God will certainly heal our land. But of course, it's going to take a lot of thought. It's going to take a lot of structure. It's going to take having to look at where do the injustices still continue to linger. And it's going to take a lot of self-sacrifice. So somebody posed a question.
I'll let, I'll let
Oh, okay, Lucy, I'm going to have you go first, and then I'm going to get to this question in the chat.
I was sort of dismayed when I heard that that Tim's proposal for our year was the year of listening, because I felt that we do that all the time in the Presbyterian Church. We listen, and we learn and we study. And yet I've really enjoyed this focus on people like you, to hear from people like you and Michael Chan and people who give us these wonderful perspectives. So I've changed my mind. I think the listening is really good, but I'm interested in doing. And what would be, I like that idea of the coalition building, so that we're not just talking about it, we're actually doing something. And the idea of having a coalition with our church is big and it's kind of rich and it's pretty white. How to really be partners with other churches. And I'm wondering if your church, where you go, which you said was primarily a Black church or a Black congregation, do you have coalitions with other churches, with churches that are primarily other than yours, white or different from yours? Do you see that as something that's working in your community?
Yes. So we had a partnership with a Jewish synagogue, Beth Israel, and we had many of our Jewish brothers and sisters come over to our church. But to me, it was not the depth yet, but it certainly helped to begin the interpersonal relationships and the open understanding of each other's faith perspectives. We also have a group in our church which is, belongs to a larger faith network called Isaiah. And I don't know if you have that.
Yes. Know about that.
We have several people, in fact, Vivian Ikaronke and Janae Bates, all are members of our church, and they are some of the leaders there. You know, I want to come back to your point about listening. When we form these coalitions, we still have to listen to each other. And I found it very challenging to get people to listen deeply, to listen with compassion, to listen with the deepest care for each other, because a lot of the facts that we were taught in school and in college may have missed some of the nuances that I think are important for us to trust each other. And in order to trust each other, I really have to listen to what people have been experiencing. And I have found it very, very difficult sometimes to be really open about my experiences, both in organizations I worked for, as well as in the churches that I attended, because I was afraid to rock the boat.
Mm-hmm.
And until we can create an environment where people are not afraid to rock the boat and we are able to listen to them without judgment, we might struggle to build trust. And as far as I know, you know, trust is the currency that we will need in order to invigorate and build a new type of leadership and a new type of engagement, because Native Americans tell me they have not even spoken about the hurt they experience and have experienced. We were just talking today about the Mankato massacre, the biggest ever hanging of people, mass hanging in the United States. And Mankato's just about 2 hours from where I live. And still we have not built that trust because we have minimized that tragic event in the experience of a part of our community. And until the church listens to Native Americans, they might not be open to listening to the gospel. The same, I would say, for the Hmong culture. I have a lot of friends in the Hmong culture. I've mentored Hmong students. And these are immigrants who have come to the United States with deep hurt from the war that the United States was involved in and had been extricated from their lives and family and culture, and have had to work really hard in the United States to preserve their culture. I went to the Hmong archives probably 15 years ago. It was just a little place. And I could just sense how proud the people were who visited the Hmong archives and try to hold on to their own traditions, their own culture, which meant so much to them. Because in the United States, you have to assimilate. And that is a form of injury. They say you can take everything away from somebody, but when you take away their culture, you dehumanize them. So if we build these coalitions, they're not going to be easy.
Mhm.
It's going to be very, very challenging. And it's the type of coalitions that we have to trust each other. Now, I spoke earlier about the mass democratic movement and the way in which, when we had decided we were going to march to the parliament buildings, and when people who don't have the same interests we have, but they look like us, when they come and they start throwing rocks at the police and the police start shooting at us, we know we have not gotten those people to have the same vision we have. So the coalition building is also vision building, and it is a long haul in order for us to come up with a common vision. I believe very strongly in dialogue. And I have not seen the church in dialogue yet. We've made attempts at it, even in South Africa, but we have drawn such strong denominational lines. And then we've also drawn such strong lines between our faith and that of the Muslim faith. In fact, a faith which has quite a large following, but which is often confused with terrorism or bad intentions. And yet I have met so many Muslim people that just strive for peace and everybody's well-being in this society. So should we move beyond even our denominational or our faith lines in order to build those coalitions against something that we think is a cancer in our society?
Thank you.
Leon? Dwayne Cronky.
Hi, Dwayne. Nice to meet you.
Confession of Belhar is from the Church for the Colored in South Africa, and Alan Bosak was involved in that.
Yes.
And were you involved in developing that? What was the reaction in South Africa to this confession of faith?
Yes, I was a college student at the time, and I would say I was a very uneducated college student. So I could not make a contribution in the way I wish I could have today, but I attended the hearings and the conversations, which was led by several clergy whom I know personally, and who are the people I should thank for my own education and for my commitment to justice. And so we would go to the hearings and the conversations on a weekly basis, to listen to papers presented by Alan Bosak, by his brother Willa Bosak, by A.B. Fasahi, several of the signatories of the Belhar Confession, which is where we got to learn that apartheid was a heresy, was evil, because the state church condoned it. The Dutch Reformed Church condoned it. In fact, as I said in the video that you watched, it was shaped theologically at Stellenbosch School of Theology. And so the Belhar Confession made the argument that we are all created in the image of God. That is a message I forgot. I learned it in catechism as a child, but I forgot it because so much in society was telling me that God made a mistake when he made me. And that was what South African society is. And I'm afraid that children in North Minneapolis, with shots ringing out daily and people being killed daily in North Minneapolis, may think that God made a mistake or God has forgotten us. And so the Belhar Confession was not only aimed at telling the state church and the government, which claimed to be a Christian government, that apartheid is evil and you are indulging in evil. It also helped to tell us who we were in the eyes of a wise and gracious God. That Jesus, when he died for us too. That we also can have salvation, and that we had a role to play in extending God's kingdom here on earth.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. If you don't ask me questions, I'm going to ask you questions. I tell my students that. So Rachel, you had a question in the chat, and the question was about the issue of unity. What steps might we take in the Twin Cities? So it's a very difficult time we're living in right now. I can tell you, every time there was a protest march, I had to say, is this a safe thing to do? Not safe from the fact that I'm afraid to die, being shot or attacked, and more in terms of the virus. I kept having to say, am I going to be protected enough? I'll keep my mask on, I'll try to social distance. But it was a challenge. There are many community groups that are meeting, that are trying to talk about solutions. They do it on Zoom all the time. If I didn't have a full-time job, I could be busy all week just attending Zoom meetings. But I try to attend many of them during the evenings or on the weekends. I do workshops with congregations. I try to be involved. And so the unity that we're building is a unity of let's all act on this issue. And thanks, Lucy, for saying your default is action. And so some of the actions that people are talking about is, why has the Twin Cities not become racially diverse in forever? In fact, Minnesota is regarded as second to last in the nation for racial integration. So those conversations are happening, and the church, as the church, we need to be part of those conversations. If we are not, we're not going to be able to bring the efficacy of the gospel of Jesus Christ to those conversations. And guess what? People who may not have the values that we have will dominate those conversations. Just like we find ourselves in a political domain sometimes where we don't agree with the values of particular political parties, and we feel marginalized from them. And so we will continue to feel marginalized if we are not part of the conversation. But I'm saying conversation, and I don't mean only conversation. People will go to those conversations, will have a certain amount of authority. I believe we all have power, whether it's within our own families, whether to speak to our children and our grandchildren and our in-laws. We have that power. But we also have people who come to those meetings, who work in city government, who work in state government, who work in corporations. Two Saturdays ago, I actually had a training with some people from Cargill and another corporation. And it was a very, very simple conversation about what is Luther Seminary doing to address these issues. And they said to me, we learned so much. And we're going back and we're going to be having these conversations at work, and we're going to be asking managers to make these changes. It has taken a long time. You know, I'm a great admirer of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And I think, Dwayne, you commented about that, and others were around during that time. I was not. But we forgot those lessons and the momentum and the trajectory and the steps that we had taken during that time. And it seems like America always swings back to becoming less progressive. I'm just hoping that this year, what we have accomplished now, we will not forget. We will continue to build and move forward. But that unity is only going to come until we are of one mind. And unfortunately, we hear on a daily basis the erosion of conversations like what we're having tonight. I work in the diversity field. I teach anti-racism, and I saw the executive order that the president doesn't want us to have these conversations. And I'm not saying I'm anti-Trump. I am saying when the president issues an executive order, that carries legal weight. And that discourages us from gaining traction and having these kinds of conversations in order to better our society. So I never said this was going to be easy, right? But we got to stay true to the cause, and it is our faith that drives us. It is the Holy Spirit that speaks through us, that determines our readiness. And I think this is a Holy Spirit moment in this country, as far as I am concerned.
Good.
We're actually coming to the end here of what will be about an hour-long recording. And so I just wanted to thank you for being here and for being willing to answer our questions and be in conversation with us. Maybe just in closing, do you have, if there were one thing that you said, your vision is your vision, that in order to kind of move forward, we all have to get together in unity and develop a vision together. But I would be curious, your vision for reform, for justice building. What would be one step in your vision that a place like Westminster could take that would bring us closer to equality and equity in the Twin Cities.
And that's sort of like my question. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what,
Oh,
that's a
boy,
little action there.
I have so many. So action, yes. My biggest is vulnerability. I was so thrilled when Brene Brown wrote about vulnerability, because for years I have been saying, let's be vulnerable with each other. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. Let's be vulnerable and say, I still feel like I'm still practicing racist. Let's be vulnerable and say, I don't know. Bring me along, help me. And I want to be vulnerable with you as well and say, I don't have the answers, but I do desire that the day will come that I can walk into a church and not feel like people are staring at me because they think I don't belong. I want to feel like I belong, that truly this is the body of Christ. He is the vine, we are the branches, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen. Thanks so much, Leon.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining us, and those especially on camera. Grateful for your faces, and thank you on Sunday morning as well.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.